So both of my parents are liberals. My dad, in particular, is like a pretty far left liberal. I'd say he occupies, more of like the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party. But then on social issues, he's a fair bit more libertarian. Um, because he wants all drugs to be legal and all this shit. But that's just because he's a crackhead. Like, I'm not even gonna lie with that one. But, my mom, she's more like, I guess you call her like a blue dog Democrat. Like, she's more in that Morning Joe kind of establishment wing of the party in terms of what she believes. Big fan of like Mitt Romney and Joe Manchin and stuff like that. But then at the same time, she also wanted Biden to be a lot more bold on like the union issues for labor and on the Supreme Court and stuff like that. So she's kind of, weirdly elitist in that sense. But both of them are liberals, right? So that was kind of like the media environment that I was exposed to growing up. Now, as I got older, I started thinking more independently and reading like political theory and stuff like that. I'm gonna try to eat at the same time I talk. Um, and so I ended up coming, you know, to my own conclusions about a number of issues. I think at this point I have a pretty illiberal perspective on the world in the sense that I don't think that democracy is inherently valuable or a necessary prerequisite to a functional or good society. I think it can produce good outcomes, but what matters more is you know how well the state can provide for the people and issues such as public safety, things like this, public transit should take precedence over, certain civil liberties. Like, I would give up certain civil liberties literally just to have, fast trains, safe streets, and a robust social safety net. Um, so I don't really believe in this idea of democratic fundamentalism, as in treating democracy like it's a religion. But this is a core part of the liberal project, at least in the United States, as well as, the conservative project. Maybe not nowadays, as they've moved in more of a kind of national conservative or fascist direction on the right in America. But that's still just, a minority in the party. I think the majority still, believe in some basic liberal democratic values and even, ideas such as tolerance and openness to minorities, sexual and racial, etc. Because obviously they can't run away from that, given that it's a majority position by the population in the country and you kind of have to win elections. But needless to say, there is an illiberal tendency on the right wing of the country. Um, so it kind of puts me at odds with like other left leaning people in America because I don't view, you know, democracy as being that important. Obviously, I think it's important. I don't just want democracy. I want democracy where I work, you know? I want to be able to vote on certain issues at the firm, you know? I don't think we're truly living up to our ideals as a democratic society if we do that, if we don't do that. And, to that end, you could easily say that, the ideas of someone like Karl Marx are actually in the liberal philosophical tradition of people like David Hume, for example. Um, you could make that argument. I'm not even a Marxist. I just like worker cooperatives, um, and I don't think they would work for every industry or every business. But I want to see most of the economy be either a worker cooperative or state owned. you know, with little room for private business in between. To the extent that you would have that, they'd still have to follow, you know, a lot of rules, and 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 make sure that their workers have a say through like a union or electing 40% of the board members, things like this, which is something you see around the country, or not country, but around the world. Um, so if you had to pin me down, you would end up saying that like what I want is like a radically mixed economy that still has some form of centralized and decentralized planning as to guarantee a certain level of decommodification of the economy to protect people's basic, fundamental right to life. Um, and I would like for all of that to be implemented as democratically as possible. If anything, to empower people even more through giving them referendums and more direct participation at the local level and so forth. Um, but I'm not married to the idea of democracy. You know, I see it more as a means to an end than anything, even though I also see it as something which should be strived for. I don't see it as necessary, um, particularly in a modern world where imperialist powers consistently subjugate the smaller countries of the world in the global south and destabilize them through funding armed groups, political opposition, uh, concerted media campaigns, and other forms of subversion. Um, you put these countries in a difficult position where, at times, some level of authoritarianism is justified. Take El Salvador, for example. Are there people, innocent people, who've inevitably been caught up in the state crackdown? Oh, for sure. But the amount of people who have had their lives invariably changed for the better by the policies of that crackdown, I think is going to be a lot more than the ones who accidentally got caught up in the crossfire. And that makes a difference, particularly when the gangs which were turning El Salvador into the most violent, most dangerous country in the world were funded and trained by the CIA. Um, that creates an imperial context for this as well. They during the El Salvadoran War, which lasted for over 10 years, by the United States, um, these were some nasty people that were given arms and training, and what do you know? After the war is over, they're still around, ravaging the country. So you can see how, you know, the people of El Salvador, as much as I hate making declarations like that because they sound kind of vague and humanistic, um, you can see broadly how the population of El Salvador would want to kick the gringos out, and boot the imperialists. And, the way that you do that in their context was cracking down on the gangs, which were created by this larger power. Um, and the only way you could do that was by doing a state of exception, which suspended a lot of these, constitutional rights, which sought to, ensure that justice is dealt, but uh, when your country is taken over by criminals, only serve to gum up the works and prevent bad people from, getting caught and put behind bars. Is the state of the exception ideal? No. But it wasn't ideal what they were going through before. And given that reality, they had to take bold action. Um, so this is kind of how I look at it, right? I'm not married to the idea of democracy. Um, and so, I talked to my parents about this stuff, and um, they think it's very strange. I get called sometimes, playfully, Trumpian or Trump-esque and these sorts of things, but I'm really not. You know, my mom, has found different ways of calling me MAGA, but I don't believe in that. I merely have a philosophical, not even issue with liberalism as much as I'm not, so philosophically, like, axiomatically in favor of liberalism or values which are liberal in nature. Um, and so I'm open to the idea that other ways of doing things can be valid, you know. And I think it's one of the things that makes having a conversation about politics, so difficult, at least in this country, is, before you're even allowed to have a conversation, you have to agree to certain terms which are, you know, liberal in nature, which are derived from the liberal Enlightenment, namely the idea that you and I are all rational actors, pursuing our own means, which is an inherently good notion, the idea of pursuing your desires, the idea that we're all conscious and free agents, which make our own decisions and are, operating based on education and the information that we have to make democratic choices in a free society. Before before you can even have a conversation, you have to agree to these various terms. And I think, the idea that we're free agents, the idea that there aren't adverse incentive structures informing the way that we behave and the way that we think about things, the idea that um, we are even in a free society in the first place, all of these things I think should be questioned. I mean, is it authoritarianism when, Nayib Bukele locks up a bunch of murderers? Is it authoritarianism when, American police officers walk all over the Constitution and unlawfully detain people or use unlawful excessive force? These are things which they have the power to do and very often get away with. So, so who exactly is the authoritarian here? I know I'm, you know, kind of euphemistically, facetiously approaching this subject, but to me, the lines really do start to get blurred. Um, when you look at the totality of this subject. So, what I would really like for is for there to be a kind of national conversation about this. Especially like, you've got people in this country who are thirsting for a dictator. I mean, they literally say it, you know. They people have gone to Trump rallies and asked random folks who were there, would you support Trump if he were to become a dictator on day one? And they've said, well, if he feels that he needs to become a dictator to secure our country, then I'm okay with that. Most of the people they'll ask at those rallies would say that. At least that, got put in some of these videos. And, you could say that that's a bad sample size because there are people who choose to go to Trump rallies, which is already a kind of unusual thing when you consider the fact that, like, he's been a known item politically for over 10 years now. So it's not like he's going to say anything new. If you're going to those rallies, you're probably on one of these traveling bands that of goobers that want to hear every last word that he says, which means that you're a part of a cult. Um, and so again, it's not a great sample size, but I think by looking at what these people have to say, you do get a sense for how some people in the country feel, And the fact that like some people are feeling that way, I think should allow it it should be treated as fertile ground to have a conversation, you know? That's what we should be doing. We should be talking about this stuff. Um, Not dismissing it outright, you know. But that in and of itself, what I just said is a very, you know, liberal approach to politics. If you think about it, I'm talking about the free market of ideas, free expression, debate, and so on. These are liberal notions. And again, I'm not married to this idea either, you know, of the free exchange of ideas. To some extent, I want speech to be regulated more than it is now. But um, I nonetheless think it's worthwhile to talk about, especially if we live in this kind of society where you can talk about literally anything without any fear of any kind of consequence whatsoever, legally speaking. Um, yeah, all of this is to say, I've been very intrigued recently because I've been listening to right wing talk radio because my internet has been out and therefore I am unable to listen to YouTube videos to help me go to sleep. And right wing talk radio has filled the void, and man, they they really don't hold back. They really let their nuts hang when it comes to the illiberal talking points, the anti-freedom talking points. It You listen to some of these guys, and it's like you're listening to Himmler or something, except you know they're speaking American English and they're just on FM radio. Um, but it's been enlightening to listen to, not because you know I'm unaware of the talking points. I know all of these talking points from debating people online for the past several years and having you know exposure to the Daily Wire and these sorts of things. But um, it's interesting to hear like the old media side of it, like how willing the people on there are to just literally talk like Nazis, like talk about exterminating groups of people and you know this idea that supposedly the people who died in LA, you know, deserved it or whatever. Like, they'll preface their statement by saying, you know, oh, I don't want to politicize a tragedy, but, and then they just start going on about how, like, it's beautiful that all of these, you know, lib cucks are facing extinction. I mean, it's terrible, right? It's a terrible thing to say. It's, it's not just illiberal in nature, it's like outright, you know, outright fetishizing violence and celebrating it, celebrating the deaths of people that politically disagree with you, um, which is, you know, I don't care where you fall on the political spectrum. That cannot be tolerated. You know, you can't treat that as acceptable speech. You know, which is actually part of why, you know, I'm for some level of censorship because I don't think you can live in a functional democracy and also tolerate the existence of people who call for violence against others, who glorify violence against others, and who, you know, actively actively relish in it. That's not okay. Um, at the very least, I don't think you should be able to organize politically around those ideas and utilize said rhetoric from in office, you know, in official office or while running for an office of some sort. Um, but also, you know, if that were the case, a lot of people in America would probably be in jail by now. But also, a lot of people might not be in jail because if we had laws like that on the books in the first place, you'd probably have fewer people thinking these things in the first place because they wouldn't even have access to the information with it being so widely available. You know, I don't believe in this liberal notion that you know everybody is a free rational agent who can be exposed to some information than other information, and the best information wins, the best ideas win. No, I think the social media age has taught us that human beings are not special, that we're not so good, we're not so smart, and we're highly, vulnerable to manipulation from outside powers, and that manipulation needs to be regulated and clamped down on if we ever hope to actually be free people. Um, so yeah, I mean it's nonetheless it is very interesting listening to these people talk. Um, I think I think going into the future, um, I might even find myself on one of these shows, either calling in or uh, going on directly to try and talk to these people because I think there are points of agreement that someone like me would have with them over something like public safety. But I think you could then, broaden the argument out to then say, well, also, don't you think that more social spending might uh, facilitate this broader project of increasing public safety? Because poverty is very often one of the biggest drivers of crime, especially in the U.S. So, you could talk about banning city camping and um, locking up more offenders and so forth, but also talk about how we need to approach the welfare state more intelligently. I think it could be an interesting conversation. Who knows?